Number 1. My brother-in-law just heard this story this past Christmas and has been telling my sister and I that we should post it somewhere. And so here it is. I'm surprised that my sister had never told him this story, but it already did scare her at the time. And we never discussed it much after a point in time. And I mean, it was almost 20 years ago that this happened. So, it's an old story, and I'm pretty sure no one is in imminent danger. My family has a property that backs up to a Carson National Forest in New Mexico. It's been in the family for years, and my sister and I both spent our summers up there. It's gorgeous, nice and green, cool mountain air in the summer. It was always a relief to get up there and away from the dusty ranch. My dad was ex-military, and having 2 daughters, let's just say we did lots of outdoor stuff. He taught us survival skills and how to defend ourselves. We hunted and fished and did lots of camping and hiking. To us, it was always a fun time, but I guess he felt the need to pass on his skills to us. We spent several weeks in the summer up there hiking with him and exploring the old cabins, mining communities, and checking out the Big Ditch project that was built for Red River back in the 1800s. I think that's a correct date for that, but I'm not entirely sure. Anyways, it's a great place to hike with some beautiful high mountain lakes, streams, and lots of wildlife. This happened when I was in college and my younger sister was still in high school. My dad was still at home as he had to work, and he would come up every few weeks to spend time with us. We were up there with our mum, and she mainly spent time in town or around the property painting. We spent our time on the jeep trails, or hiking and sleeping. It was late June, maybe early July. I think we decided that we were going to hike up to Lost Lake. It's one of my favorite lakes up there, because if you look at it from a certain angle, it looks like a heart. We set off in the morning and were prepared. We both had a small pack, our water, some snacks, and we both had a small hammock that we planned to set up once we get to the lake, so we could just enjoy the area for a while. I'll admit to being an outdoorsy person, and I swear, when it's quiet enough, you can hear the trees talk. We also both always carried a knife when we hiked. My dad always insisted that we have something with us, just in case an accident happened, or we just needed it. The hike was going good. Since the summer cabin is pretty far up the valley, we just set out on foot to the trailhead. To get to Lost Lake, you take another trail that goes up to Middle Fork Lake. Then you break off that trail for Lost Lake. We run into a few other hikers, but they are going to Middle Fork Lake, and we were pleased because it looks like we could possibly have Lost Lake all to ourselves. It's a pretty good hike with some long switchbacks at the end, but totally worth it because the lake is just beautiful and a very pretty emerald green color. We got there and we saw that we did have the lake to ourselves. We hiked around the lake and decided to hike back a bit and to find a good spot to set up our hammocks. We walked into the tree line, and the first thing my sister said was, "Do you smell that?" And yes, I did. It was a dead animal with the strong scent of blood. We had both done lots of hunting and knew that smell, and that's when I saw it. Placed around the carcass in a circle were its organs and entrails. But it wasn't like it was being cleaned. It's like they were placed in a certain arrangement, with little piles of rocks in between everything. Now, I know how some people get disgusting with their skills, and I've had some guys try to gross me out, but I don't fall for that crap. However, this made me very uneasy. It wasn't being cleaned. Something specific was happening. It was arranged in a certain pattern. There was a meaning behind it. I stepped back from this weird circle, and then my sister starts to say my name, but she stops mid-sentence. Because at that point, a guy appears out of nowhere. He looked as if he just climbed out from the inside of the deer because he was covered in blood and doesn't have much clothing on. At first, I thought he didn't have anything on, but honestly, I didn't try to check him out. He was standing back, away from his gruesome little circle, just standing close to a group of trees that were pretty close together. He was maybe 20 feet away from us. I think he was trying to hide from us. Not for sure, but my dad had always taught us that if we ever found ourselves in a situation where we didn't feel in control of it, to do something in our power to try and take control of the situation. Do something that is going to take the other person by surprise. And don't do what they expect you to do. So, this was raging through my brain, and I also could tell that my sister was about to freak the hell out. So I stepped back and said, "Hey, pretty good kill you got there. Did you use a bow?" The guy just stood there, his eyes all crazy wide, like he was stoked out of his brain on planet Pluto. So I'm thinking, great. We ran into a guy getting his hunt on, and he'd just lost it, and was getting blood crazy with his deer. He was staring me down, and I was staring right back at him, and my sister was getting ready to run. I still don't know what came over me, but by then, I put my hand on my knife that I kept on my waist, just to show him that I wasn't completely helpless, and I wasn't scared. I don't know why I did it, but something told me to let him know that I wasn't going to back down. I kept my eye contact with him, and would guess that he was maybe in his early 30s. I'm pretty bad at guessing people's ages. He was pretty dirty though. You can tell that, even with all the blood that he had everywhere. I started to back off, and my sister had moved behind me. So I spoke again and said, "So, you having a great hunting day?" Again, the crazy man didn't say anything. He just stood there like he was a statue or something, or like he thought that I couldn't see him if he didn't move or make a sound. We moved back to the lakeside again and booked it around the lake. My sister stayed up front and she was shaking pretty bad. I was mainly pissed off at first because if he wanted to get all crazy in the woods with his deer, then he should have gone further back into the forest. We get back to the trailhead and stopped to get our bearing and looked at each other. I was scanning the forest line to make sure that we weren't being followed, and my sister was still in shock. We started going down the trail pretty fast, and I was hoping that I could keep my sister together until we could at least reach the Middle Fork Lake Trail, or that we would even run into some more hikers. But the odds weren't good on this particular trail, because you have to get an early start on the Lost Lake Trail, and by now, it was late morning/afternoon. We were making good time and hadn't discussed what we saw, and just started hiking back down. I started to get that feeling when you know you aren't alone. I kept checking, but I didn't see anything, or even hear anything at first. My sister refused to look back and just kept going, but I felt that I had to keep checking to make sure the idiot wasn't following us. That's when the first stuff came flying at us. It was some small pebbles, but it really pissed me off because it was obvious that someone was throwing them at us, and it could have only been that guy. My sister was almost running at this point, but I'm a mouthy smart aleck. I blame the Texas upbringing, and darn it, this is my forest. I'd grown up here, and these were my lakes, my trails, and I wasn't about to let some crazy dude ruin it for me. I started yelling back that he needed to go back to his deer and leave us alone. At this point, my sister is telling me to shut up and just come on. And I'm thinking, no way, and this guy is just trying to scare us. The pebbles stopped, and then we started hearing barking and growling noises. My sister said, "Now he's fucking growling at us?" And I just told her to just keep going down the trail and ignore it. He was behind us pretty much the whole way down, growling and making these barking noises every once in a while, but I never caught a glimpse of him. Once we got close to where the trail joined in with the Middle Fork Trail, he seemed to back off. I never caught sight of him behind us, but I could hear him and I just knew that he was there. We started going down the rest of the trail. My sister refused to stop or look behind her, so I kept checking every so often. I didn't see anything or even hear anything anymore. We started to discuss what had happened, and she felt like he was very sinister, that he had bad intentions, and she felt that we'd been in some serious danger. However, I had a different take on it. I felt like he was just getting his kicks out of scaring two girls. I mean, he'd have to have heard us coming around the lake. We weren't being quiet, and it was the opposite because there were black bears up there, and we would always try and make as much noise as possible while hiking, hoping to scare off any bears in the area so we wouldn't come across them. To this day, she still thinks he was sinister, and I think he was just trying to scare two girls and was getting his kicks out of it. We told our parents, and my dad didn't like what he'd heard. He did teach us some more close-up defense skills after that day, and forbade us from ever going hiking alone or just the two of us again. We didn't hike up that trail for several years after that. I freaked my sister out, and I just didn't like remembering a time that I was scared in the forest that I considered my own. I didn't know it at the time, but after we had gotten back to the house and told my mum, she'd called up some of the neighbours, and a few of the men hiked up there the next day to check things out. They did find deer carcass and some empty hiking packs, like what day hikers use, but they were empty. They also found a rustic campsite further back in the woods that had been cleared out. Number 2. I don't really know how to start this, so I'll just jump straight into it. I will try to keep it as short as possible, but also I want to make sure that what I'm saying is clear. I'm a photographer, and there is a nature preserve maybe 2 or 3 miles from my house. I don't live in the best of areas, so it's one of the few places that I could go within walking distance to get a decent shot when I need one to post for my social media. Being maybe 19 at the time, I was fortunate enough to have my mother to drop me off on this occasion. The plan was for her to show up a little over an hour later to pick me up, to save the multiple-mile trek back to our little home. Unfortunately, that isn't how things panned out. Just as we pulled up, another car did as well, just a few seconds later. My mother was a little bit suspicious because it isn't a very popular destination. But mothers always worry, so I ensured her that I would be fine and allowed her to head back home to do things she needed to do. There are 3 different ways you can go initially. A path that leads left, one that leads right, and one up the middle. They all kind of loop back around to the same spot, but it's a solid mile before it does so. I opted to take the middle trail as it's the most scenic, but paused near the entrance as I was still adjusting my equipment and taking some test shoots before moving deeper where I might potentially see wildlife or something worthwhile. This is when the man who pulled up after I did came in and proceeded up the center trail as well. I continued fidgeting with my equipment even after having it properly adjusted as I waited for him to pass me. And as he did, he attempted to talk to me, something along the lines of, "Getting good photos?" Which any photographer will try and get when they're out shooting. I responded with something simple and kind, but also in a dismissive tone, because I had no interest in continuing to converse with him. Something about him made me incredibly uncomfortable. So uncomfortable, in fact, that I decided to stay in that initial entrance area to photograph some boring-ass plants, and even after he disappeared around the bend and out of my line of sight. I'm so thankful that I did that, because within 5 minutes, he somehow managed to complete the full loop and end up back behind me. The loop takes me at least a solid 15 minutes to get through, and even when I'm in a hurry, he either busted ass to circle back around me, or took a shortcut to do so. Noticing I was still by the entrance, he passed me again, walking through the exact same way that he'd just been. And this is when I knew that there was something absolutely going on. I stood there and watched as he walked the exact same path even down and around the bend out of my sight. I continued watching in the distance down at the bend, where I lost sight of him for a few seconds. And what do I see? Him peeking around the corner to see me, watching me. Once he noticed that I saw him, he disappeared again. This is when I simply said, "Fuck this shit," and I left. As soon as I exited the preserve, I took off in a full sprint, hoping that I could put some distance between the two of us. Just as I was about to turn down the side street, I turned back to see him exiting the preserve and entering his vehicle. My phone was dead. I never charged the damn thing, and I had absolutely no way to contact anyone. I was at the point where I contemplated running up to someone's house and asking them to help or call someone for me, but I was worried that I would seem like the crazy person. I turned the corner, and once again, we no longer had sight of each other. I was out of breath and unable to keep running. I just began to pray that he was no longer going to follow me. Maybe this was all just a weird coincidence, right? Apparently, prayer doesn't work, because within a few moments he was back in sight, turning the corner and beginning to approach on the same street that I was on. My mind was racing with all the possibilities of what he was going to do, but without much time I decided that I wasn't going to give him the opportunity to do anything. I continued walking until he literally pulled up within a feet of me, and his window began rolling down. I threw my bag down onto the ground next to me, turned in his direction with bold fists, and shouted with the full power of my lungs, "I will kill you if you don't get the fuck away from me." The angry little scowl that he had on his face this entire time faded and began to resemble more of a deer in a headlight. He didn't know what to do. He then nervously uttered, "You know, I have rights," before speeding off to never be seen again. I then had to complete the walk to my home, constantly looking over my shoulder and hoping that he didn't make another approach. I'm just glad to have made all of the decisions I made that day, because I genuinely have no idea what would have happened on that day if I didn't. I do not know if this story will come across as horrifying as it was in person, but if it doesn't, then it's simply a failure of my writing ability, because it was a truly terrifying experience that I will never forget.
Number 3.
A few months back, my girlfriend and I were bored hanging around the house and spontaneously decided to go out for a hike. We don't go hiking often, but the idea appealed to both of us, and even though there was only about an hour left of light, we figured we had enough time to go enjoy a hike before it got too dark. We quickly filled up our water bottles and put on the best walking shoes we had, and we were out of the door, driving up into the mountains. Around my area, there are many hiking trails, with the variety of trails increasing as you go up into the mountains. We tended to stay around the base of the mountains, in the occasional case of us hiking, where most people would still be walking, but we wanted to change things up and progressed further up the mountain road to a trail a friend of mine had mentioned. We kept in mind our time and figured that we could hike for a bit and simply enjoy the new environment for us and finish up before it was too late. We arrived at the trailhead and see that there were no cars left along the road where the trail commences, but didn't think much of it due to the time. We still had a good 45 minutes until dark, so we continued on. We start walking down a fairly steep hill that then recoups the elevation at the bottom with an equally steep hill that you have to ascend. We reach the top and then it's smooth sailing from there. We see a lone coyote off of the trail a ways off and some rabbits, and I made a quip about how those rabbits might need to be careful with that coyote lurking around. My girlfriend then playfully hit me for that one. Approximately less than a mile into the trail, we see a large fallen tree that made a bridge over a dried riverbed and decided to take a rest, climb around it and take pictures. We're there for about 10 minutes and then resume hiking. We continue on the trail for a short distance until she hears a rustle in the trees behind us. We stop, mildly spooked due to the assumed size of whatever made the rustling, but continue on briefly before she decides she's done and that we need to head back. It's twilight now, so I agree with her and we turn back around to go back to the car. When we made it back to the fallen tree, my shoe had untied, so I used the trunk to fix my loose laces and looked behind us for the first time on the hike. Uncharacteristic for me, but hey, I was having fun, why be paranoid? However, as I turn around, I see a person dressed entirely in black and with their hood on that was a significant distance behind us, walking at a slow, even pace. And it wasn't something out of the ordinary. So what if they were wearing black with their hood on? I wear black most of the time and it's cold out. I shouldn't be making assumptions. This does trigger me to be more alert, however, and I inform my girlfriend of this person's presence. It's now dusk. We continue on at an intentionally faster pace and go through a windy section of the trail, and I lose sight of the person. When we come around the final bend of the section, I figured they are far behind us and that there is nothing to worry about. Sooner than later the person is behind us again, but much closer, probably 50 feet in comparison to 100 feet before, and we had increased our speed, so this alarmed us. We briskly walk around another bend, and as soon as we came around it, we book it. And it seemed to be a natural reaction on both of our parts, as we just started running without a word said to initiate it. We were nearing the trailhead now, with only the hills to deal with. We catch our breaths for a moment, and I turn around again. And I see the person seemingly halt a sprint upon noticing me looking back, as if they were trying to uphold the illusion of simply walking. And at this point I shout, "Go!" and we sprint down the hill. What little light was left struggled to make its way through the dense trees surrounding us, and the steep hill proved challenging to run down without a clear path to be seen. We both stumbled down the hill, almost falling multiple times and slamming our feet onto rocks and loose brush. But we didn't fall, and we didn't look behind us. We make it to the bottom, but must continue up the initial hill, and then we will have made it. We persevere up the incline and make it back to our car. I briefly breathe in relief as I start my car, heart pounding and adrenaline racing. As I reverse onto the road, the person emerges at the trailhead, apparently breathing heavily. We finally get a glimpse of him. His hood had fallen off of his head, exposing his pale complexion and dead eyes that were only illuminated by a single lantern at the start of the trail. He was holding something in his hand, but it was too dark to see, and I was not interested in sticking around to make out the object. I shift into drive and accelerate as fast as my car could muster, leaving him behind in the dust of the empty side of the road. Night trail stalker dude. Let's not meet.
Number 4.
Around 9 months ago, me and my partner had just bought a new 6-month-old boxer dog to keep our 3-year-old Labrador company, and decided it would be a good idea to take them for a walk in the countryside. We live close to a large city called Hull in northwest England, and decided to go for the walk in rural-ish area north of the River Humber that ran through the city. Upon getting to a village close to a local landmark, a World War II army fort, we decided to walk close by and through the small patches of forest close to the nature reserve. We walked along a grass bunker towards the forest, and suddenly my partner pointed out 2 young men had begun walking up the bank from the woods in a diagonal manner as if they were trying to cut us off. From close by, I wondered if the 2 young men were attending some sort of a World War II reenactment, as they were both wearing camouflaged pants and were also covered in dust and dirt. I thought nothing of them both, but I was sure that they would pass us, but as they grew closer, it appeared they were aimingly walking towards us. They were at least 10 feet away when they stopped, and one of them spoke up. The way he spoke still bothers me to this day, as he seemed to have a disregard for manners or even trying to make sense. The young man wanted to know where we were planning on walking, and we told him that we were not really sure and would just see where we ended up. He then looked disappointed by this and suggested that we should take his route, which went through the forest to what he described as a great place to sightsee and sit, as there were benches to sit down on. While the young man was telling us this, the other boy kept his eyes on our 2 dogs the entire time, and as if he wanted to make sure they were always in his sight at all times. We did not have much knowledge of this area and had not seen any other dog walkers, so we took the young man's advice after they pointed to an opening in the woods. So we walked into the forest. The woods cast out about 30% of the sunlight, and as I looked back, I saw that the young men had not walked off, but were just watching us walk into the forest. The track looked as though it was man-made, as it seemed to be the only walkable area throughout the forest. About 2 minutes into the trek, our Labrador began sniffing behind a bramble bush, which at first we thought nothing of, as both of our dogs sniff everywhere that they can when we walk them. However, she began sniffing in one specific spot and started rolling on the floor. We went over to her and saw that she was sniffing some sort of a shattered rubber pig mask with brown red liquid on it. And it looked disgusting, and my partner forced the dog away from it, as it looked as though flies were crawling all around it. Further into the walk, the woods had turned into a long path of trees and bushes that had become very narrow, but we could see a turn far ahead, and we agreed that if it led nowhere, that we would turn back. I walked ahead, and I was on my phone preparing to take a photo of the woods when I felt several small pricks on my neck, chin, and part of my face. I let out a gasp to alert my partner, and he told me to stand still in an alarmed way, followed by him carefully removing thin pieces of string away from my face. As it turns out, someone has tied fishing hooks on lines to a tree in the walkway. It's safe to say that we were both terrified, confused and angry at the same time. After this point, we hurried back to the car and left back home. I don't want to sound cliche or anything, but as we drove off, I swear I could see someone through the back mirror peek out into the road. I'm not 100% sure whether or not the person who laid out the fishing hooks were the people that we talked to earlier, those young men, although it would make sense. But nevertheless, I hope I never meet those guys again.